Hello everyone, this is History 231. This is going to be Lecture 13, which talks about early Rome up through the Roman conquest of Italy as they began their expansion here. And of course, many interesting things about early Rome, but one of the most interesting is, of course, what happened before Rome really was a major power. And the interesting part is that Rome is located halfway up the Italian peninsula, literally right in the middle of the Italian peninsula, which is a good location if you want to control all of Italy and be central. The second important point, of course, is that Rome is not on the coast but has access to the coast because of the Tiber River. So they have access to the coast, so they can actually communicate and be involved with the sea without actually having to be on the sea itself. And this was a nice benefit. So location, 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 as they say in real estate, is the big thing. So Rome is in a really excellent location in terms of this, and it's one of the reasons it's going to historically be so very, very important. And of course, at the moment, Rome and Italy are in the midst of this terrible virus outbreak, and so we're all holding them in our hearts, and we hope that the Italians and the Romans are all going to be okay with all of this. But let's talk now about the very earliest history of Rome, what we know about the earliest history of Rome. And the first thing to be aware of is there are really two groups that have a major impact on early Rome. One of them are the Greeks. The Greeks, remember, had settled in southern Italy. Southern Italy, they called it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. There were so many Greeks who settled down there in southern Italy. And even today, if you go down there, you find lots and lots of Greek names and that sort of thing in southern Italy. And then up in northern Italy, we have a group called the Etruscans. The Etruscans are very interesting and something of a mystery, because we don't know a lot about them. We have only limited amounts of textual evidence for them. They are quite early, and they clearly had a very, very sophisticated culture, and they clearly influenced early Rome a great deal. They have very interesting art, for example. The Romans later on said, the Etruscans, they're very, very religious people. So things like that that you start to see here. Etruscan society seems to have been made up of different clans here. Each clan has its own leader and all that sort of thing here. Where do they come from? Well, according to Herodotus, the Greek historian, who told us all sorts of interesting things about all sorts of interesting things, not all of which are likely true, but he said they came from the east. And for many, many years, people said, that's just Herodotus, he made stuff up, this is just the way he is. But in fact, now we're beginning to find that there may be some truth to old Herodotus. We should always take him more seriously than perhaps we might think here. So the Etruscans began to decline in about 550 BC as the Greeks began to move in and began to sort of push them out here. And that's something we start to see. There's also some Phoenician influence from the city of Carthage. Carthage gets a star, which is going to be much more important in a later lecture, but I just want to mention it here. And they, of course, come from what is today Lebanon. The Phoenicians are the founders of Carthage, but Carthage is also going to be extremely important to early Rome here. So let's move on to Rome now. All right, Rome, of course, is interesting. Where does it come from? What are the origins of Rome? Well, this is a good question because, of course, there are two ways you can look at the origins, not just of Rome, but of any group of people. There are the evidence from things like archaeology, and then there's the evidence of their own stories about themselves here. And so let's take a look at this question, the archaeological evidence and the textual evidence. The first thing to keep in mind is the textual evidence. What the Romans had to say about their own origins is, not contemporary. That is to say, it was not written at the time. It's much later. It's sort of looking back. It's sort of like if you were to say, where did the United States come from? But you didn't actually look at George Washington's diaries or anything. You just looked at what we say about this today. The accuracy may be a little bit questionable about it. It may say more about what we are doing today than it did about what George Washington did. So we have to be a bit careful in looking at Roman stories about their own origin because, they may not be entirely accurate. Archaeology, of course, gives us all sorts of useful things, but it does not have written text, so we don't have the words of the early Romans. So these are the two things that we have here. So what do we know about these guys here? What do we know about the Romans here? Well, the first thing is The Greek influence. The Greeks have a huge influence on Rome. They always will, all right? The Greeks were, of course, culturally a dominant group of people. We've spent a lot of time talking about them. The Romans themselves traditionally looked at the Greeks and said, oh, those guys are much cooler than we are. We want to be like them, at least culturally. Militarily is another thing, but culturally the Romans had kind of an envy thing going with the Greeks. And the Greeks were happy to encourage that. It's always nice when you get people to think you're cooler than perhaps you are. The Romans, like the Greeks, are Indo-Europeans. That is to say, the language of Latin is very much like the language of Greek. It is an Indo-European language, which shows a certain commonality there as well here. So that's something we can say they have in common. So what does the archaeology say here? Well, let's have a look. Rome is at least 3,000 years old. Now, the problem with doing archaeology in Rome, then or now, is that, well, you can't just show up in Rome and start digging holes in the ground. They take a dim view of that over there. And so you can't just dig in Rome archaeologically. So when we find stuff about early Rome in Rome, we often find it when they're digging subway tunnels and things like that, where you don't have to go straight through the floor of somebody's house or some important historical monument from a later time. So we know that Rome is at least 3,000 years old. It's very possible it's even older. Remember, it's got a good location. It's on the Tiber River. It has access to the sea without having to be on the coast. So that's a nice sort of thing as well. All right. We know the Bronze Age in Italy came to an end around the 11th to the 9th centuries BC, which is kind of where it came to an end everywhere. Iron Age took over here. All right. So we see this as well. And what we see archaeologically is a number of things. Number one, political and social control are being consolidated. That is to say, there are centers of sites now where decisions and important things like that are being made. This leads, of course, to the issue of defending yourself from your neighbors. So defensive needs. Now, of course, it's always easy to see archaeologically when there are defensive walls and that sort of thing going up. They leave a big footprint here. So we see defensive needs are increasing here. And this is accompanied by a third point. Society is becoming more stratified. That is to say, there's an increasing separation between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and everybody else, and this sort of thing. And so you start to see this happening in Rome in these earlier periods here. And we can tell this from our archaeology here. So this is an interesting kind of thing. We also see evidence of religious practices. One of the things about religious practices is they often leave a very large archaeological footprint. Temples tend to be big. They tend to attract a lot of attention, and they tend to last because they're built to last. And so we start to see evidence of the religious practices of early Rome in these early time periods. And from this we can start constructing the evolution of the city here. So, for example, they paved the Forum. The Forum, of course, was the center of town. They went to the trouble of paving it. Now, when I say paving, it doesn't mean they went and laid down asphalt. They were using stones. So that took a lot of work. So they paved the central area around 625 BC or so. They put together a royal shrine or dwelling called the Regia. Right, in about 630 BC. This would be the house of the king of early Rome, and you see this. We also see the Comitium, the assembly area, and the Curia Hostilia, the Senate house, by about 600 BC. And then finally, around 600 BC, the first tangible evidence of the cult of the Vesta. Okay, the Vestal Virgins, the famous Vestal Virgins. We start to see this. So we start to see archaeological evidence that the Romans are getting sophisticated, they're getting consolidated, and all of this sort of thing. And this moves away from the previous period where you have villages and that kind of thing here. So that's what we can tell about the archaeology of early Rome. What did the Romans say? It's always good to ask, what did the Romans say about their own origins? Where did they come from, they say? Well, foundation myths are very interesting things because what they tell you is often what people want to believe about themselves, all right? And that's historically very valuable, even if it's not factually accurate, it's very valuable because it tells us something about the people themselves. So the Roman foundation myths are basically multiple myths which are come from a number of sources, and they basically work like this. There were these two guys. They were twins. One was named Romulus and the other was named Remus, and I've given Romulus and Remus a star here. And usually, traditionally, they come from the 8th century BC, but we don't know for sure. And old Romulus and Remus, well, they were twin brothers, and they had all sorts of typical twin brothers sorts of things, including conflicts with each other. This is what those of you who have siblings can relate to. Those of us with siblings can always tell the stories of we've squabbled with our siblings. That's what siblings do. They always have, they always will. All right? And we've seen this in other cultures as well. Cain and Abel, for example, from the Bible. So this is not unusual. And so Romulus and Remus, well, they squabbled. All right. Now, according to some traditions, the god Mars, the god of war in the Roman pantheon, was their father. And according to the legend, anyway, is these two brothers founded Rome. All right. But then they got into a fight. Now, those of you who have siblings know that you eventually will always fight with your siblings. And that's normal and that's fine as long as it doesn't get out of control. When you squabble with your siblings, it's part of normal growing up. But here's some advice from your old history professor, and I have two brothers, so I can tell you this from personal experience, okay? You don't want to take it too far. Here's what happens. Romulus and Remus fought, and Romulus wound up killing Remus. All right? Which reminds us, of course, of the story of Cain and Abel. Romulus kills Remus. All right? Fratricide. That's very bad. Don't do that. All right? That is a very, very bad thing. All right? Then Romulus now is going to be, he's the king. He's in charge of the early Romans, but he has himself a problem. They don't have any women. There are no women around. And how long is your culture going to last if you don't have any women in it? Well, it's a very simple math equation. One generation, and you're gone. They know this, so they said, we need some women. Well, according to the story, where did they get the women? They went to their neighbors, and they kidnapped them. This is a very bad thing. You shouldn't do this, all right? If you want to get a wife or a girlfriend, you should wine her and dine her and be nice to her. Do not abduct her. That is not only illegal, it's immoral, and you shouldn't do it. But this is what they did. So they went and grabbed all the Sabine women, we are told. Which means, of course, that the Romans and the Sabines become one group, because, of course, the Sabine women married to the Romans here. It's a rather sordid tale, but there it is. All right. So this is the story of the origin of Rome, and, of course, what does it say? There's a number of interesting things we want to talk about with this origin of the Romans, and it's a creation myth. It's an origin myth. Number one, and this is something I want you to keep in mind. Notice how it is not an origin story of a people. It is not an ethnic origin story. It is an origin story of a city. All right? It is a city, not a tribe, not a nation, but a city. There are other Latin-speaking cities in the area. They don't have the same origin story, even though they're all probably related to each other. So this is an important thing here. The Romans came from diverse backgrounds, and they are Romans first. That is the most important thing. The second thing which is interesting about the story is that the Romans have divine ancestry. The god Mars, the war god, is the divine ancestor of the Romans. And this is a very interesting kind of thing. Having a divine parent, well, that's always a good thing. At least I suppose so, although I can see some really big drawbacks to that as well. When did they say it happened? Again, we can look at archaeology, but when did the ancient historians say it happened? Well, what they say is that the Roman Republic, which we'll come to in a moment, was founded in between 509 to 506 BC, and before this there are 7 kings of Rome, we call the canonical kings of Rome, and they ruled for about 250 years. So you can do the math, and you're probably better at it than I am, because of course I'm terrible at math, but you can do the math here. This is when they said we came into being. Now, obviously, we know the city of Rome is much, much older than that. So that's an interesting thing. So this brings us to the next phase in Roman history, and that is the period of the Roman kings. All right. The Romans were first ruled by kings, which is fairly typical in the ancient world. Kings were kind of a normal way that people would run things. And according to the Romans, there were a list of kings here. A list of kings, and those kings were what we call canonical kings. And there's a number of interesting things we can tell about the Romans by looking at these various and sundry kings here. Now, Are they all historical figures? Do they really exist? It's a little harder to say. But the Romans believed that this is where they had come from here. So we have these kings. So Romulus is the first king. He's the first king, followed by Numa Pompilius. I gotta say, Latin names are so much fun. Numa Pompilius was the second king. Tullus Hostilius was the third king. Then we have Ancius Marcius, and then we have Mr. L. Tarquini, the first Tarquini. Then we have Servius Tullius, and then we have L. Tarquini, the second one. And L. Tarquini, the second one, had a nickname of Superbus, which tells me that if nothing else, he must have had a really awesome chariot, probably with really cool pictures on fire on the side and cool leather. Who knows what it was? But anyway, he's called Superbus, all right? Now, the later kings were quite certain are real guys. The earlier kings were not as sure about here. But here's the thing. Each of these kings is credited with setting up parts of the Roman state and Roman society. For example, Numa Pompilius is credited with creating the religious institutions of Rome, including their calendar. And calendars, of course, are a very important thing in any society. Tullus Hostilius, befitting his name, is a warrior king. And Ancius Marcius was a peaceful king, we say, all right? Even though Ancius Marcius did conquer and destroy a nearby couple of towns here, all right? He annexed them and so on and so forth. So even the peaceful guys, well, they could be violent as well here. Now in 579, Tarquin was murdered, and his successor, Servius Tullius, is probably a Latin guy, and he seizes power by force. This is going to be an important point. He seizes power by force here. And he seems to have expanded the citizen body of Rome by taking the local rural population, making them citizens as well. And this is a really important point. He created a citizen army of all men who could afford to buy weapons, who could afford to arm themselves. And that's actually going to be very, very important. Because the notion of citizenship, which they get from the Greeks, remember the Greeks had had this notion of citizenship in their polis, all right? The notion of citizenship is going to become central to how Rome is able to expand, because they take a slightly different view of citizenship than the Greeks do, all right? And basically the idea was we can always expand the citizen body. So Servius Tullius is going to get a star for all of his activities, especially the creation of the first legion. Now, a legion, and it gets a star as well, is the standard Roman military unit, all right? A standard Roman military unit. It had 4,000 infantrymen, 600 cavalrymen, this first legion here, and it was organized into centuries. And of course, if you are a mathematician, you say, well, there must have been 100 guys in each century. Well, it seems that the Romans, like me, weren't very good at math, and they said, no, it's 96 guys in each of the legions. I don't know why. Go figure. That's the way they did it. But in any event, at some point, it became customary for these legionnaires, for these troops, to meet, to get together at a place called the Campus Martius. Now, campus, because of course, normally, when we're not under lockdown for all this nasty virus here, we meet on a campus. A campus is a meeting place. And it's important to have campuses. It's important to have places where human beings meet face to face. Now, obviously, during a time of crisis like we're in right now with the coronavirus, we can't do that. That's just why I'm talking to a camera. But it's important to have places to meet, all right? One of the problems with online learning is you cannot meet face-to-face in person, and that does definitely make it harder to learn. And I apologize that we having to do it this way, but this is the way we have to in this current situation. But normally you come to campus. A campus is a meeting place. For us, it's a meeting place of students and instructors and professors and other people, but in other situations it can be something else. You can have a business campus. You can have all sorts of different kinds of campuses. A meeting place here. So the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, which is outside the city walls, and these guys would get together outside the city walls, and they formed what is called the Comitia Centuriata here. And this is a really important point, all right? To the Romans, there was no limit necessarily on citizenship. You could become a citizen without being born in Rome, and that's very different from the way the Greeks did it. To the Greeks, you had to be born in the polis, you had to be a native-born guy, and you had to be a guy, of course, because they're sexist. You couldn't just move in. You couldn't immigrate so much in the Greek world. And so this is something that we see here as well. Now what this does is it allows the Romans to develop a much larger state apparatus than the Greeks could ever do. And this is going to be allowing the Romans eventually to build their absolutely vast, massive empire and that sort of thing. All right. So they never developed democracy the way that the Athenians did, for example, but they did have this open-ended kind of thing. Servius is succeeded by a guy named Tarquin the Proud, who apparently was so unpleasant, such a really unpleasant guy, that the Romans finally said, okay, we can't handle this. The wealthy, the powerful, the aristocrats in Rome decided in 509 BC, this guy is out of control. We cannot have this. And they kick him out. They literally threw him out of office, showed him the door, and said, you're out of here. You are totally out of here. We're taking over. Now, here's the thing. What do you replace him with? It's one thing to get rid of a tyrant. It's one thing to get rid of a bad guy. Fine. Then what? That is going to be the really tricky question. What do you do then when you've kicked out the tyrant? And what the Romans do, first and foremost, is decide, we're never going to have another guy like this. We're never going to have another tyrant. Nobody is ever going to rule over us illegally. No one is ever going to be able to violate our laws that we're going to set up and take power. Because if you take power illegally, we are not happy. And taking power illegally becomes the big, big, big bugaboo for the Roman Republic. And they go crazy whenever they think someone is going to try this. And I want you to remember this, because as we go further into early Roman history, this is going to be a really, really big deal. So Romans say no one ever is allowed to take power illegally, and they build their entire political system to prevent that from happening. And for that, we have to move on to our next part, which I will give in the next exciting lecture once I get a new battery into my camera here.